Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I was sipping a chilled glass of Vernaccia, legs stretched out on a terrace that overlooked the soft rolling hills of Tuscany, when my phone started buzzing with that ugly urgency only bad news carries. I almost didn't pick it up. I was 3 days into a 2-week solo retreat, finally allowing myself to breathe after what felt like years of running my life like a damn spreadsheet. But there it was, my neighbor's name, Donna Mathers, flashing on the screen, and something in my gut twisted before I even heard her voice. "Sarah," she said, breathless and tight like she'd run up a flight of stairs with a knife in her back. "Jake, your brother, he sold the place. He sold your damn farmhouse." At first, I just sat there staring at the olive trees like the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. I blinked hard, like maybe the Italian sun was frying my brain. "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked, already standing up, already moving, already grabbing my keys and stumbling toward the rental car like instinct knew before reason did. "I mean it," she said, her voice shaking now. "He was showing people around last week, but I thought it was just one of his dumb business ideas. I didn't think he'd actually go through with it. But he did. New owners moved in yesterday, boxes, trucks, the whole 9 yards. The whole vineyard estate, our family's legacy, was mine. Had been mine for 6 years, legally and emotionally. After our parents passed, I bought out Jake's share when he said he wasn't into dirt and grapes. He took his money and ran to God knows where, occasionally showing up like a bad penny when he needed something. But that land? That house? That was mine, every inch of soil and every weathered brick in that old farmhouse. How the hell could he sell it? I didn't even realize I was shouting until a waiter glanced nervously in my direction. I mumbled an apology, heart thumping so hard it felt like a drum inside my throat. I threw some bills on the table, rushed to my hotel, packed in 10 minutes flat, and booked the earliest flight I could find. I didn't even tell the spa I was leaving. I didn't care. Nothing mattered except getting home and seeing the damage with my own 2 eyes. On the flight back, my mind wouldn't stop spinning. I kept opening the deed document I had saved in my email, reading and rereading the lines that clearly said the property was mine. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't mistaken. Something was very, very wrong. Either Jake had committed fraud, or I was about to find out something that would blow a hole in everything I thought I knew. And here's the thing that really gets under my skin. This wasn't just property. This wasn't some vacation home you forget to winterize. This was the place I grew up watching my dad fix tractors and my mom braid herbs into drying rings in the kitchen. It was Sunday dinners on the porch, muddy boots by the back door, and wine that tasted like sweat and history. It was my sanctuary, my anchor, and now, apparently, someone else's starter home. Let me ask you something while I'm still halfway across the Atlantic, gripping the armrest like it's a lifeline. What would you do if your own sibling sold your childhood home behind your back? Would you burn every bridge to the ground or just build a bigger wall around your heart? Has someone you loved ever betrayed you so deeply it felt like they reached inside your chest and ripped something out? Let me know in the comments. I'm all ears, because I sure as hell don't know what to feel right now except rage. Jake hadn't called. Not a single text, not a goddamn voicemail. Typical. Coward. He always found a way to let other people deal with his messes, mom, dad, me. He was charming, sure. Everyone said it. The kind of guy who could sell you your own shoes and make you thank him for it. But he was also reckless, impulsive, and, apparently, capable of casually committing grand larceny over brunch. The turbulence hit just as the plane started descending. I remember gripping the seat in front of me, not just because the cabin jolted, but because the weight of what I was about to walk into was heavier than anything that plane could carry. My phone buzzed the second we touched down, and I snatched it up like a drowning woman grabbing driftwood. It was a message from Clint Barrett, my old family lawyer. A man with a voice like sandpaper and a mind like a steel trap. He was retired, mostly, but still took my calls. The text was short, ominous, and somehow worse than Donna's call. "Call me. It's worse than you think." And that's when I knew, whatever Jake had done wasn't just betrayal. It was something deeper, darker, and far more twisted than I'd imagined. The sun hadn't even fully risen by the time I stormed through the front doors of Clint Barrett's office, heart still pounding from jet lag and rage woven together like barbed wire under my skin. His office hadn't changed in years. Same old leather chairs that creaked like tired bones, same mahogany shelves lined with dusty law books no one ever opened, and the same scent of cigar smoke clinging to the walls like a stubborn ghost. Clint looked up from his desk, grim expression etched deep into his weathered face, and gestured for me to sit without saying a word. I didn't. I couldn't. I just stood there, arms crossed and knuckles white, waiting for him to confirm what I already knew would make me want to scream. "You want to sit down for this?" he asked finally, voice low and steady like he was talking to a woman on the verge of shattering. I didn't respond. He sighed and leaned back in his chair, then slid a manila folder across the desk toward me like it was a death certificate. "Jake sold it," he said. $3 million. Buyers listed as an LLC goes by Monroe Holdings. I stared at him, unblinking, trying to process the number that had just rolled off his tongue like it was no big deal. $3 million, I said, slowly, deliberately, like maybe he'd misread a 0 or 2. "That house, that land, it's worth over $9 million, Clint. You know that. You appraised it yourself last year." "I know," he said with a nod, looking older than I remembered. "I tried to stop it, Sarah. But the paperwork, it's messy." Jake used an old provisional clause buried in the family trust. Loophole bullshit, barely legal, but enough to slip it through without immediate red flags. I took the folder with shaking hands, flipping through copies of contracts, bank transfers, and property documents. Every page felt like a punch to the gut. And then I saw her name, Tasha Monroe, the name I'd heard a few times over the last year, mostly in passing, always attached to Jake's smug little anecdotes about his brilliant girlfriend with a genius business idea. A wellness brand, or a vegan skincare line, or some other vague nonsense that always sounded more like a Pinterest board than a business. But there it was, Monroe Holdings. Her LLC. She was the buyer. She was the one holding the knife my brother had plunged into my back. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jake without thinking. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice as casual and breezy as if nothing had happened at all. "Hey, sis," he said, like we were just catching up over coffee. "Back from Italy already?" "You sold my house," I said, ice in my voice and fire in my chest. "You sold my goddamn house, Jake." "Technically, I sold part of the estate," he said, that smug tone creeping in like mold under wallpaper. "And come on, don't make it sound so dramatic." $3 million, I spat. "For a $9 million estate. To your girlfriend's shell company. Are you out of your goddamn mind?" "She needed it more than you," he said without hesitation, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "She's got investors on the line, Sarah. She's building something big. You've already had your chance to build your legacy. It's time someone else gets theirs." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. I just stood there in Clint's office, phone pressed to my ear, mouth open like I'd just been punched in the throat. "You stole from me," I said finally, voice trembling. "You betrayed me for a woman you've known for what, 2 years? You sold our parents' land like it was your poker money." "Don't be so dramatic," he muttered again. "You'll understand one day." The call ended, but the fury didn't. If anything, it boiled hotter. My mind spun backward through years of Jake's bullshit, the way he used to charm Mom into covering his college debt, the way he guilt-tripped Dad into co-signing loans he never intended to pay, the way he always walked away clean while someone else picked up the shattered pieces. He was always the golden boy, the charismatic screw-up with a smile that could hide 1,000 lies. And now, he'd finally taken what he wanted, same as always, but this time, it was mine. I couldn't even look at Clint. I grabbed the folder and walked out the door without another word, my heels clicking like gunshots against the tile. I drove straight out to the property, my hands trembling on the steering wheel the whole way. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to feel the betrayal in the soil beneath my feet. But when I pulled up to the estate, something didn't sit right. The new security gate was in place, and a small team of movers was hauling boxes into the old guest house, just the guest house. The main farmhouse, the heart of everything, stood untouched. Windows closed, doors locked, shutters drawn like it hadn't seen a soul in weeks. I stepped out of the car and stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Something was wrong here. Something wasn't adding up. Because if Jake had sold the whole estate, then why was the main farmhouse still mine? And that's when it hit me, he hadn't sold what he thought he had. And whatever game he was playing, it was about to turn into a war. For a moment, I honestly thought I was losing my mind, standing there in the driveway with the afternoon sun glaring off the roof of the main farmhouse like nothing had ever happened, like my world hadn't just been flipped sideways by my own flesh and blood. The building looked exactly the same, weathered oak doors, faded blue shutters, and the stone porch where my father used to sit with his boots kicked off, sipping bourbon and staring at the vineyard like it was his personal cathedral. Nothing had changed, nothing at all, and yet everything felt completely off, like someone had moved the pieces of my life just enough to make me feel unbalanced, but not enough to explain how the hell it had happened. The movers were still fumbling around on the far side of the property, unpacking sleek white boxes labeled with obnoxiously trendy branding, Tasha's company name stamped all over them like she was preparing for a grand opening of some overpriced lifestyle cult. But they weren't anywhere near the main house. They were swarming around the guest house, which I hadn't stepped foot in for over a year, mostly because it had been slowly falling apart and I never saw much point in renovating it. That place had termite damage, faulty plumbing, and a cracked foundation that would have made an engineer weep. It wasn't worth a damn dime without major investment, and yet there they were, setting up as if it were the crown jewel of the property. I walked up the hill toward the farmhouse, half expecting someone to stop me, but no one did. The path was still overgrown in places, my old wind chime still swinging lazily in the breeze from the side porch, and the lock on the front door was exactly the same one I'd installed myself last summer. My key still worked. The door creaked open like it always had. The scent of aged wood and lavender oil hit me instantly, and I felt my heart lurch into my throat, not from grief this time, but from confusion and something dangerously close to amusement. I walked from room to room, every inch untouched. No furniture missing. No sign of tampering. No boxes. No signs of staging. No change. The house was exactly how I'd left it. That's when it hit me like a brick to the skull. Jake hadn't sold the main house at all. He'd sold the guest house. That crumbling, useless structure on the edge of the property that barely stood upright on good days. That and apparently some slice of land bordering the vineyard. He had either lied outright or had no clue what he'd actually managed to sell, and honestly, I couldn't even decide which possibility was funnier. I went back outside and stood on the porch for a long while, looking down at the swarm of activity in front of the guest house. I could hear someone barking orders, and then I saw her, Tasha herself, in a tailored white jumpsuit and sunglasses big enough to double as satellite dishes, waving her manicured hands around like she owned the damn world. She was pointing at walls, directing furniture placement, talking into a Bluetooth headset like she was running a Fortune 500 company instead of whatever half-baked brand she thought she'd just launched. And that's when I laughed, deep, guttural, from the gut laughter that bent me over and left my ribs aching. I hadn't laughed like that since I got the call. Hell, I hadn't felt anything besides betrayal and white-hot fury for days, but that moment cracked something in me wide open. Because Jake, in all his arrogance and ignorance, had sold her a half-condemned structure and a patch of dirt, thinking he'd pulled off the heist of the century. But he'd actually just handed his girlfriend a steaming pile of legal liability wrapped in ribbon. I pulled out my phone and called Clint, who picked up on the first ring. "Clint," I said, trying to catch my breath between snorts of laughter, "you're not going to believe this." He didn't sell the house. He sold the goddamn guest house. That rat trap at the edge of the vineyard. She doesn't own the house. She owns a glorified tool shed with a plumbing issue. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Clint let out a low chuckle. "Well, hell," he said, "I always knew that boy had a special kind of stupid in him." But beneath the humor, something darker settled in my chest. The house was still mine, sure. But that didn't erase what he'd tried to do. It didn't change the fact that Jake had taken legal loopholes and twisted them until they bled just to impress a woman who thought essential oils were currency. It didn't undo the fact that he'd stabbed me in the back, smiling while he did it, convinced he was justified in ripping our family legacy out from under me. And that's when the laughter stopped. I looked out across the land, my land, and I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The anger came back, colder this time, sharper, more focused than it had been since the beginning. He'd tried to break me. He'd tried to erase me from my own damn history. And now I was going to make him regret every smug little decision that led to this moment. I lifted the phone again, voice low and steady now. "Clint," I said, "I'm not just getting revenge. I'm going to make them beg me for mercy before this is over." There's a certain kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing you're 2 moves ahead of the people who tried to bury you, a sharp and dangerous calm that settles in when you stop reacting and start planning. I spent that night walking through the vineyard under the stars, boots crunching softly over dry soil, glass of wine in one hand, rage cooling into something more precise and calculated than the fury that had eaten me alive just a day earlier. Revenge wasn't just about anger anymore. It was about elegance, timing, and pulling strings so gently they wouldn't even feel the noose tightening until it was too late. I made my first call before sunrise, dialing a friend I hadn't spoken to in years, but who still owed me a favor big enough to wake him before his morning coffee. His name was Miles Dalton, a former corporate acquisitions consultant turned semi-retired winemaker with just enough charm to make women blush and just enough bite to make fools sweat. I told him what I needed in one breath: a fake investor, a believable pitch, a well-crafted trap that would appeal to a desperate influencer with delusions of grandeur and a rapidly ticking clock on her imaginary empire. He didn't even hesitate. "Send me the details," he said. "I'll make her think she's about to be the next goddamn Martha Stewart." Within 48 hours, Miles had fully transformed himself into an executive named James Morrow, supposedly a silent partner in a luxury wellness conglomerate looking to acquire vineyard properties for a premium new line of organic wines and upscale retreats. He arrived in town dressed in tailored suits, driving a leased Mercedes, with a business card sharp enough to cut glass and a pitch that would make any starry-eyed entrepreneur foam at the mouth. And just like clockwork, he found his way to Tasha. It wasn't hard to bait her. All it took was one well-placed meeting at a high-end cafe, where Miles casually mentioned he'd heard about a promising new venture, setting up shop near the old Whitmore estate. Within 10 minutes, Tasha was practically throwing herself across the table, flashing her teeth and talking about synergy, cross-brand marketing, and potential expansion deals like she actually knew what any of it meant. Miles played it perfectly, attentive, intrigued, but just distant enough to make her chase the opportunity like it was her golden ticket out of mediocrity. Meanwhile, I was preparing my own move on the home front. I announced a massive community event at the main farmhouse, an open house celebration with local wine, food trucks, live music, and a tour of the estate to celebrate my so-called new chapter as a fully independent vineyard owner. The response was overwhelming. Everyone wanted to see the farmhouse again, everyone wanted to sip the wine that had put our name on the map, and everyone wanted to feel like they were part of something real, not whatever sterile, over-branded mess Tasha was hawking next door. The day of the event, my land was overflowing with laughter, music, and the scent of fresh wood-fired pizza. Cars lined the road, neighbors brought their families, and the air buzzed with that old-school community spirit you can't fake no matter how many Instagram filters you throw on a photo. Meanwhile, Tasha's launch party over by the guest house looked like a discount yoga retreat, half-empty chairs, confused delivery drivers, and a caterer that backed out last minute after accidentally booking my event instead. I didn't even have to sabotage her directly. All I had to do was shine brighter. But the real stroke of genius came when Miles proposed his deal. He told Tasha his company was prepared to buy out the rest of the land, $5 million, clean offer, but only if her LLC could prove full legal ownership of the main estate and the surrounding vineyard. That's when the panic started creeping into her voice. She needed everything to look airtight, seamless, ironclad. And that's when she did the one thing I'd been waiting for her to do. She asked Clint Barrett for help. Clint, bless his cold, wicked heart, didn't even blink. He took her call with the same deadpan professionalism he always carried, nodding along as she gushed about potential investors and expansion deals and market domination. He told her he'd be happy to look over the documents. Told her he could prepare a full ownership review, help smooth out any wrinkles before the big acquisition. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly guessed, was that Clint had already been working with me behind the scenes, feeding me every scrap of information we needed to pull the rug right out from under her perfectly pedicured feet. I could barely keep a straight face when Clint called me later that evening. "She just handed me her entire file," he said, chuckling like the devil himself. "I've never seen such a mess in my life. It's like someone tried to build a house out of wet cardboard and empty buzzwords. And now the pieces were falling exactly where they needed to be. Because while Tasha thought she was standing on solid ground, the truth was she didn't own a single inch of what mattered. All she had was a crumbling structure on a code-violating lot and a pile of half-baked paperwork that was about to collapse under the slightest legal pressure. And when she tried to push forward, when she tried to act like she belonged here, she'd find herself trapped in a web so tangled she wouldn't know which way was up. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was strategy. This was war. And I wasn't pulling punches, I was laying landmines. There's something truly intoxicating about watching someone trip over their own arrogance, especially when you've laid every brick of the path they're stumbling on, every misstep carefully designed and placed with surgical precision. It wasn't about money anymore, hell, it stopped being about money the minute I realized Jake hadn't even understood what he sold. This was about dignity, about history, about making it abundantly clear that you don't get to stomp on my legacy and expect to walk away unscathed. And nothing, absolutely nothing, tastes sweeter than watching a con artist's fake empire unravel under the weight of her own blind ambition. After Clint received Tasha's bundle of so-called legal documents, he spent 2 full days dissecting them like a seasoned hunter gutting a deer, meticulous, methodical, and entirely unforgiving. When he finally sent me the revised contract, the one she'd need to sign in order to streamline her alleged expansion deal with the fake investor, I nearly spilled my coffee laughing. It was a masterpiece of quiet revenge wrapped in legal language so dry it would have bored a judge to tears. But buried within the fine print, tucked between harmless-looking clauses and polished phrases about access rights and infrastructure upgrades, was the kill shot. An ironclad 99-year lease transferring the only habitable structure on the property back to me for a symbolic fee of $1 per year. The brilliance of it wasn't just in the deception, it was in the simplicity. She was so eager to impress her fictional investor, so blinded by her hunger for validation, that she signed the paperwork without even bothering to run it through a second lawyer. All she saw was opportunity. All she heard was money. And that's the problem with people like Tasha. They don't look twice when the numbers look good, and they sure as hell don't stop to question who's smiling behind the curtain. When the papers were signed and filed, Clint delivered them to the county office with the kind of smug satisfaction only a man who's seen decades of legal warfare can truly appreciate. I, on the other hand, waited. I waited for the storm to hit, for the inevitable moment when Jake would figure out what had happened. Because it wasn't just her mistake, it was his gamble, his deal, his illusion of power that was about to be dragged into the mud. And then it came, just 3 days later, when Jake showed up on my doorstep looking like someone had pulled the rug out from under him mid-sprint. He didn't even knock, he just barged in, eyes wild and mouth already foaming with indignation. "You think this is funny?" he shouted, waving the lease paperwork like it was a murder weapon. "You think this little stunt is going to undo what I did?" I leaned against the counter, sipping my wine slowly, deliberately, and looked him dead in the eyes. "No, Jake," I said calmly, "I don't think it'll undo what you did. I think it'll just make sure everyone sees exactly how goddamn stupid you were when you did it." "She signed it without knowing," he barked, slamming the paper on the counter. "You tricked her." "No," I said, with a slow, cruel grin. "She tricked herself. I just handed her the pen." He stood there, seething, pacing back and forth like a caged animal who finally realized the door had been locked from the outside the whole time. "You're not getting away with this," he muttered, mostly to himself. There's gotta be a loophole, a clause, something we can challenge. There's not, Clint said, stepping into the room from the hallway where he'd been waiting, arms crossed and grin matching mine. We drafted that lease tighter than a nun's alibi. She doesn't own anything worth a damn now. Congratulations, Jake. You sold her a rotting guest house and a 99-year obligation to your sister for $1 a year. Jake looked like he might explode, jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. And for a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Because in that instant, I saw it in his eyes, not just anger or humiliation, but something deeper, something colder. Regret. The realization that he hadn't just failed to steal from me, he'd sabotaged himself so thoroughly that there was no way to crawl out of the mess without tearing everything down around him. But just when I thought it couldn't get better, Clint casually tossed another file onto the kitchen table and looked me square in the eye. "You want the real kicker?" he asked, voice low and dry like a man who knew he was about to enjoy this next part far too much. I raised an eyebrow, half expecting another clause or another mistake in their contract. But Clint just smiled wider, tapping the top of the folder with one slow finger. "The payment never cleared," he said. "The $3 million? Never went through. The LLC's account bounced it. The money doesn't exist." I stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in slowly, like molasses sliding down the side of a jar. "You're telling me," I said, almost too stunned to laugh, "that not only did they sign over the only usable building on the property for $1 a year, but they never actually paid for it in the first place?" "Exactly," Clint said. "They never owned a damn thing. All they did was sign a bunch of paperwork and dig their own grave with a platinum shovel." And then I did laugh. I laughed so hard I had to sit down, tears welling in my eyes, lungs burning from the sheer absurdity of it all. Because in the end, it wasn't just revenge, it was art. It was justice served cold, delivered with a side of poetic humiliation and a garnish of bitter irony. And somewhere in the chaos of it all, I realized something else. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. There's something deeply satisfying about watching the final card fall exactly where you knew it would all along, especially when the people who stacked the deck thought they were the ones dealing. After Clint dropped the bomb about the payment never clearing, I spent the rest of that night sitting on the porch of the main farmhouse, watching the stars flicker above the old vineyard like quiet witnesses to the kind of justice money can't buy. The whole thing unraveled faster than I expected, like a cheap thread tugged loose from a knockoff dress, exposing every single flaw Tasha and Jake tried so hard to patch over with pretty words and empty promises. Turns out, Tasha's LLC wasn't just broke, it had been hemorrhaging cash for months before they ever stepped foot on my property. Clint dug through the financials and uncovered a trail of unpaid vendors, defaulted loans, and bounce checks that would have made a used car salesman blush. The $3 million payment had been nothing but smoke and mirrors, a wire transfer initiated from an account that no longer had enough money to cover a used lawnmower, let alone an estate. The transaction had technically never completed, which meant one very simple thing. Legally, officially, and undeniably, I still owned every inch of that land. The irony was sharper than a broken wine glass. Jake's betrayal hadn't even bought him a slice of paper to wipe his mess with. He'd thrown away our family's history, my trust, and his own reputation for absolutely nothing. He hadn't sold the property, he'd only sold the illusion of it. And that illusion cracked wide open the moment Tasha disappeared, skipping town like a rat from a sinking ship the second the fake investor vanished and the debt collectors came sniffing around. No note. No apology. Not even a text. She just vanished, like she was never real to begin with, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills, some worthless marketing materials, and a boyfriend who looked more pathetic by the day. Jake showed up at the estate again a few days later, all soft eyes and sagging shoulders, like the prodigal brother who thought I might welcome him back with open arms just because he was finally out of options. He didn't even try to pretend he wasn't desperate. He stood in my kitchen, hat in hand. Literally, he wore that same old ball cap from our college days and tried to spin it all like some grand misunderstanding. "I thought I was helping," he said, voice thick with something that wasn't quite remorse, but wasn't pride either. She convinced me this was going to help both of us. She said she could turn it into something real. I let him ramble, let him pour out every half-baked excuse and poorly stitched justification like it might somehow undo the choices he made. I listened, not because I believed a damn word of it, but because I wanted to watch him twist in his own discomfort. And then, once he was done spinning the yarn, I looked him dead in the face and said the only thing that had been sitting on my tongue since this whole circus began. "You sold me out for a woman who couldn't sell bath bombs at a flea market," I said, cold and clear, watching the color drain from his face. "That's your legacy now, Jake. That's what you've got left." He didn't respond. He just stood there, the silence growing thicker with each second, until it wrapped around him like a noose he'd tied himself. And in that moment, I saw him for exactly what he was, not just a screw-up, not just a traitor, but a hollow man who had finally run out of people to manipulate. There was no redemption arc coming for him. No second chance. Not from me. What he didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Clint, not even Miles, not even the neighbors who kept asking what I planned to do next, was that I never really wanted to keep the estate in the first place. Not permanently, anyway. I'd always loved it, yes, and it would always carry pieces of my soul stitched into its walls, but the truth was, I'd outgrown it. The vineyard, the farmhouse, the land, it had become a chapter that was meant to close, not one I intended to die in. What I really wanted, what I'd been quietly dreaming of before all this chaos, was to leave it in the hands of someone who would actually give a damn about it, who would protect it, nurture it, and honor its roots. And so, while Jake was still standing in my kitchen, still grappling with the weight of his own stupidity, I made the final call that would seal this entire saga once and for all. I donated the land to a veterans nonprofit organization, one that builds retreat centers for former soldiers struggling with PTSD and reintegration into civilian life. They'd turn the farmhouse into a healing space, a place of peace and community, a place where people could rebuild something inside themselves without ever having to steal it from someone else. I signed over the property with a full heart and no regrets, and for the first time in weeks, I finally felt free. Jake left without another word that day, slinking back to whatever motel he'd holed up in, broke, bitter, and completely alone. I don't know where he went after that, and frankly, I don't care. I stopped tracking his footsteps the moment he walked away from our family's name like it was a burdensome coat he never wanted to wear. Let him rot in his own bitterness if that's what he chooses. I'm done cleaning up after him. Funny thing about betrayal, it doesn't kill you. It just tells you who you were really feeding at your table. And now, for the first time in a long, long while, my table's finally empty of snakes.